Okay. Good morning. It's 9:06, and I would like to have each of the members introduce themselves, starting with Karen.
Karen Chang, public member.
Rodney Diaz, otolaryngologist, public board member.
Marcia Raggio, audiologist, board member.
Dee Parker, speech language pathologist, board member.
Todd Borges, hearing aid dispenser, board member.
Debbie Snow, board member, public member.
Paul Sanchez, executive officer.
Sabina Knight, legal counsel.
It isn't mandatory, but if any members in the audience would like to introduce themselves, please do so now.
Linda Pippert, speech language pathologist and board chair for the CASHA.
We have a quorum and we're ready to go. Our first item this morning is going to be behind tab 7.
And we're talking about the discussion and possible action on proposed legislation regarding Business and Professions Codes 2835.35, 2539.4 relative to locked hearing aids disclosure from hearing aid dispensers and dispensing audiologists. We have Heather Olivares, our legislative and regulatory analyst, with us.
Okay, so at the October 10th through 11th board meeting, this language was discussed and some concerns were raised regarding a lack of clarity on some of the terms that were used in the prior version of the language, such as proprietary hearing aid software, corporate-owned stores, and franchise hearing aid manufacturer. And additionally, there was a desire to specify exactly what the consumer notice should state. So I went back and revised the language, and I have brought back some new language for us to discuss. And after we discuss the language and any changes you may wish to make to the language, we should also discuss whether or not to include this as a legislative proposal in our sunset report. So the two sections that will be amended are for the hearing aid dispensers and the dispensing audiologists. That's Business and Profession Code 2538.35 and 2539.4. The language to be amended is exactly the same for both code sections, so I'll just go through it one time. So the revised language would state, a licensee shall, prior to the sale of a hearing aid that uses hearing aid software that can only be programmed, serviced, or changed by a specific manufacturer or servicer, provide the consumer with a written notice in 12-point font or larger that states the following. The hearing aid being purchased can only be programmed, serviced, or changed at specific facilities or locations. The written notice must be signed by the consumer prior to the purchase and kept and maintained with the records pursuant to Section 2538.38.
You'll have to remind me what the contention was about using those other terms, because going back or using this language makes it equally difficult to get across what we were trying to say, and that is every hearing aid manufacturer has their own software. Everybody who dispenses that product would fall under this category. That's not what we're trying to say. We're trying to say only those entities who are so proprietary that they can't take their products somewhere else. So in this case, if I fit Oticon and Amy fits Oticon, they can go to either office. But if she doesn't, then they have to come back to me. So this new language, I don't think solves that. But can you remind me what the problem was with saying those other terms? Because those are more accurate.
So the problem was they weren't defined. And so it was unclear even then who exactly it would apply to. And we talked about using the language locked, which we still can, but at some point it needs to be clear exactly who it does apply to and who it doesn't. And so if this still doesn't get there, we need to talk about, well, how can we get there?
Let's see, you said corporate stores, proprietary.
Yeah, the
Software.
terms we had before were proprietary hearing aid software, corporate-owned store, and franchised hearing aid manufacturer.
I know when I was researching it myself, the term franchised was commonly used to describe these entities. So I don't know if there's another term we could use besides those three that captures the idea that if it's a Costco hearing aid, that Costco purchaser cannot go to Joe Blow hearing aid dispenser and have a program. But if they went to Joe Blow and got an Oticon and went down the street to somebody else who had Oticon, they could do that. How do we make that distinction in this language here? So it's those people that we want to protect.
So the other thing we can do is use the terms, but then define what exactly those terms are, or maybe just use one term, so
Yes.
we're only defining one term versus
That sounds
defining
reasonable.
three
Yeah.
terms.
Mhm. I like that idea of just pick one term, let's define that. And if we have to throw in the word locked, that seems kind of informal, that term, but that is the essence of it, is nobody else can program it, nobody else. Although, I don't know, Amy, if somebody brought in a Bernafon hearing aid from Costco, if you had a Bernafon private account, could you get that repaired for them? Or could you, I don't know, send it to Starkey Allmake and they could, so you actually could service it? I don't know.
Yeah. Using your example of Costco as an example of how tricky this is, because within Costco there are different brands that are sold, and some are locked proprietarily with software and others are not. So, and that changes based on who has what contract at what time. So,
Interesting.
I think that talking of terms, and if you have to define terms, and Todd could certainly pipe in on this too, I think proprietary locked is probably the two words that make the most sense. We're using, it could be, Oticon software. I don't want to pick on Oticon, but whatever. Signia software is Signia software, but when it's sold by Miracle-Ear, it becomes Miracle-Ear software. And now that hearing aid, even though it's a Signia hearing aid, is locked to Miracle-Ear. So now that patient can't go anywhere but Miracle-Ear to have that device worked on, even though it's a Signia hearing aid. So it's very confusing,
Yeah.
which is why you're having such a hard time.
Well, I think you need to define, there's a difference between servicing and programming.
Agreed.
If someone came in with a Costco hearing aid that the software was locked and it was not functioning, say Phonak or whatever it might be, Bernafon. If I have a Bernafon or Phonak account, I could send it to them and get it repaired, or I could send it to an Allmake lab and get it repaired. But I couldn't do anything to the programming once I got it back. Mm-hmm. And that's the issue, is the programming, because sometimes when it comes back repaired, the programming hasn't been saved. And so now it's preset to manufacturer settings, which is not appropriate probably for their hearing loss, and there's no way for me to fix it. Mm-hmm. So we could end up worse off than we were to begin with. So there is a big difference between, and I think we have to delineate between servicing and programming, because the issue is programming here, not really servicing.
True. Although I would argue, if I had that same patient come in, I would say, well, I cannot send it for repair because I can't save your programming, and therefore make sure that when it comes back from repair, that hearing aid is properly set for you anymore.
That's true, but then the person could also give them the option. Look, I can't program it, but the odds are it may come back with the program saved. We're good, or it may not. It's you're playing Russian roulette with it.
No.
But you do have the capability of servicing it. Is my issue. Is you can technically service it. You just may not be able to program it when it comes back. And ultimately, programming is the ultimate issue here that we're really actually, I think, getting at with this particular verbiage. So I think we need to, be more specific.
I spoke with the, Western United States Costco representative for hearing aids, and he said we would send the software to anybody who wanted it. If you had somebody come in who had a Costco hearing aid, you could call us, we'll send you the software. but you have to load it. You've got to have that on your computer. But Miracle Ear would not return my phone calls at all. So I never got word from them one way or the other.
Well, and I would take that with a big giant grain of salt, whether or not they actually would. Saying they would and actually doing it are two entirely different things. But it's also confusing because when you talk to the manufacturer, they will tell you, oh yeah, you can program Costco hearing aids.
Right. And
Because they don't even really necessarily know the person you're talking to on the other line, whether it's locked or not. Because I've tried and it just sits there and stares at me. So.
Right. And the to make it a little more complicated, because that's what we want, is technically with most any of the major brand software, Oticon, Phonak, you can put a locked code on there. So even though you're fitting them with a Phonak hearing aid that isn't locked, or that the software isn't making the hearing aid locked, the provider can choose to lock it to protect their intellectual property for how they've programmed that hearing aid,
Right.
which then means the consumer's in the same boat, where even if they didn't buy what we would think of as a proprietary locked software hearing aid, the provider has locked it because they've put a special code in that to then access that programming has to then be unlocked with that
How
code.
common is that?
Which you see with people who do private label hearing aids.
Right.
Some of the larger private businesses out there that might private label their hearing aids,
Right.
they're more likely to lock the software to show that, see, our hearing aid is unique from everyone else's. Only we can adjust it.
It's a
So,
way to
yeah.
get around letting other people access it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way to capture your
I haven't
patient
seen
base
it.
and not
Yeah,
release them.
like Todd mentions, I haven't seen it much from one-on-one providers.
Yeah,
It's
it's-
more from big franchise type locations.
But it's that possibility.
Yeah, exactly. So they shouldn't be let off the hook either, in my opinion. I mean, the patient, the client, they just need to be aware that that's happening. I think it's really unfair. So I'm glad you guys are taking it up, even though it's complicated.
Yeah. We just have to come up with language that's, not too convoluted to try to get at this,
Yeah, something
what
with
Heather's trying to say.
proprietary locked coded.
I mean, locked, I think, speaks to it. I mean, it is kind of simplistic, but locked really, in a nutshell, describes it because it is truly locked. My only issue with the way it's written is because when we do say programmed, serviced, or changed, again, serviced is a little bit loaded because you can and technically service the hearing aid. You just can't reprogram it. So, I mean, it depends on how fine a point you want to put on it, legally speaking.
So I just came up with some possible language to try to get us a little bit closer, at least. Starting out with defining proprietary hearing aid software as hearing aids that have been locked to prevent access by other providers, or we can flesh that out some more. And then have the consumer notice state the hearing aid being purchased uses proprietary hearing aid software and can only be programmed at specific facilities or locations.
That sounds pretty good.
Okay. Yeah, so we'd be defining the term proprietary hearing aid software, and that would be the only term we'd be using that needs to be defined. And we define that as means hearing aids that have been locked to prevent access by other providers. And then the consumer notice that would be required, and we'd keep the 12-point font and all that other stuff, just changing what the consumer notice needs to say. To say the hearing aid being purchased uses proprietary hearing aid software and can only be programmed at specific locations or specific facilities or locations. And we could maybe add on that use the same software or something like that so that we're specifying what the other facilities or locations are, that they have to be ones that use the same software. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I know
or
you're
no?
already saying proprietary, so
Okay, so just leave it as
it's kind of
that.
implied that
Can you
that's-
identify it somehow like as within our group, some way to identify that it's the organization that I'm employed by that you can go get it reprogrammed
So we
with, as
talked-
opposed to saying us, meaning, does that mean just me, my location? Not I can't go to the Costco down the street or the Miracle Air Beltone, whatever down the street. Some way to identify it as a corporate entity or a group entity within our group that it can be done.
If we just said the seller's locations,
Well, we talked kind of about that last time, and there was concern that you wouldn't really necessarily know what the other locations are because they're always, locations are coming, new locations are opening, other ones are closing, and we didn't want to go down the road of requiring the person selling the hearing aid to have to provide some kind of list, because that
Yeah, we
list
did
would
talk
need
about
to be maintained over time.
But aside from providing a list, if we specified that these could only be reprogrammed or programmed at the seller's locations, then it would be on the seller it would be to their benefit to provide a list. Because if I was trying to sell to someone and now I'm telling them they're limited, I'd want to say, but look at all these locations you can go to.
Yeah, honestly, I have no problem with providing a list. Personally, I think it would be worthwhile because as a consumer, if you're telling me on the one hand, I can only go to certain places to get my hearing aids adjusted, I kind of would want to know what those places are. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people come in to my office and say, I'm moving. Is there anyone in my area that can also program these hearing aids? Well, it is, you can go online and you go to the website of the manufacturer, find a provider, you can do it. But they have to jump through hoops. And if you're talking about an 85-year-old person who maybe not even have internet in their home, it's something they really can't necessarily do. And honestly, if we're talking about primarily corporate entities here, their lists are fairly static. The offices don't necessarily come and go with, I think, that much regularity. The number of franchisees that are out there can be fairly stable. And I agree with Paul. I think it would be to their benefit to provide a list so the person knows what they're getting for their money.
We want to put that in statute, though?
I don't think it's necessary. I think what we want to tell the consumer is that what you're buying there may be some limitations here. And again, it's to the benefit of the seller to tell them, well, there's limitations, but I have all these locations you can go to. I don't think we need to require it.
Oh, yeah, because, my local AccuQuest office just closed, and that's was surprising to me. But they did. So it's possible that even though you think a big corporate entity like that would not close a local office, they do and can. So would there be a way for us to perhaps massage this language a little bit more if we all agree on the essential content of it so that we don't have to bring it back? Or
We can, or we have time to bring it back too. If we're
We'll have
talking
time to
about
discuss it.
bringing this into sunset, we have a couple more meetings at least before
Okay.
that.
Not to open Pandora's box, but just curious.
Go ahead.
From a consumer side, what's the benefit of having a locked hearing aid?
That's a good question, because I don't think there is one.
Necessarily a benefit per se.
People go to their local office who just don't realize it. That's
In the case of Costco, yes. In the case of Miracle Ear or Beltone, not necessarily, no.
So a hearing aid is just a hearing aid. There's no reason to lock it.
Well, the reason to lock it is to make sure they continue to come back to you.
Okay. So from a
That's and some state that allows them to, in the case of say Miracle Ear or Beltone, it allows them to have that identity. This is a Miracle Ear hearing aid.
like a brand.
Exactly. It allows them to brand themselves a Miracle Ear location.
Okay. So since it's not a consumer benefit at all, why do we as a board allow them to lock hearing aids?
I don't
Yeah, I was
think
going to
that's
say I don't
regulate
think
that?
we can tell them not to do that.
Oh, okay. Just wondering.
We don't regulate the manufacturer.
To say you can't lock hearing aids because it's not fair to consumers.
I did canvass a number of those organizations, and some of them said, well, we don't really want to do that. We don't intend to do that, except for the Miracle Ear not calling me back. I don't know how they feel about it. But they were really okay with, having other people deal with their software if you wanted it.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't want to be so exclusive. But they are. So
Right.
it is what it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if we wanted to do something about it, it would have to be in statute. Or we'd have
Yeah,
to,
or have to be in like a legislation or something,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, it
Okay.
wouldn't be up to this board to regulate
Oh,
that.
okay. Okay.
So should we do that then, that you might rework this
Yeah,
and
bring it back.
send it to Todd and I, or anybody else on the committee, and I think just to see if we're all on the same page with the new language.
Well, did you want to formally refer it to a committee or just informally?
Right, so you can assign,
So do
Madam
you can
Chair.
you can assign it to a subcommittee to work on it with staff.
yeah, and you don't have to name those members right now. You can figure out if they're interested and then talk to them later about it. Or you can have one board member work directly with the staff, or two.
We can refer this to, or
Yes.
Would it be inappropriate to have anybody who's on the hearing aid dispenser committee participate if they want to? I mean- Oh, I see.
Well, we're talking about I think, kind of working on language first as a subcommittee, and that could be you and a member of the hearing aid dispensers
Okay.
committee. And then I think we're past a specific committee working. If that's up to you, if you want the hearing aid dispensing committee to talk about this more, or if you want the committees to work on it and the committee working and bring it back to the board.
I think the two people is
Okay.
fine
two people and work
with
together
Heather.
and with Heather and define. Spina, does that cover it? You can just do it that way. Okay. This is confusing.
Now we'll go on to item number 9, legislation update, review, and possible action.
Okay, so if you want to turn to the legislative report that I provided in your binder, a couple of legislative calendar highlights that are coming up. Today is the last day to introduce any new legislative bills for this coming year. And then April 24th will be the last day for policy committees to hear fiscal bills in the first house. And May 1st, 2020 is the last day for policy committees to hear the non-fiscal bills in the first house. So we're just gearing up for the new legislative year, and there'll be a flurry of activity in March and April of hearing these bills that have been introduced. So in your report, I have kind of a combination of bills. Some of these are bills that we looked at last year that are still possibly moving through the process this year. And then a wrap-up of bills that we looked at last year that have either been signed or vetoed by the governor, and a couple of new bills. So I'll go through all of them. The first one is AB 598 regarding hearing aids for minors, and we looked at this bill last year, which would require health plans and health insurance policies to include coverage for hearing aids up to $3,000 every 4 years for all enrollees under 18 years of age when medically necessary. This bill, I got information from the author's office that the governor was planning to veto the bill. He had some concerns with it, so rather than do that, they pulled the bill at the end of last year, and they're planning to amend it to create a state program that would help families pay for hearing aids. There isn't any draft language of what that will look like at this point. So I put for the recommendation to discuss whether you want to maintain the support position the board took last year, or consider adopting a watch position in anticipation of the amendments and wait and see what those amendments look like before deciding how to move forward.
I'm kind of leaning toward the watch after what you said, but I had heard, I'm not aware that the governor was kind of putting aside a pot of money for pediatric hearing aids for people who didn't qualify for Medi-Cal but didn't have private or had private insurance, but they still couldn't afford it. Is that the same entity you're talking about here? Is that true? And-
Yes, so they are working with the governor on how to help families pay for hearing aids. But at this point, we don't know what exactly that language would look like. So I feel like the board still has, we can still say we're supportive because we're supportive of the idea of improving access to hearing aids. So we can kind of change the direction of what our letter would look like if we stay in support. Or, of course, move to watch and wait and see what this language looks like before deciding how to move forward.
We have time to support later? We would?
Well, we could always have a telephone meeting if necessary. Or just, we don't know when the language will be available, so it's possible that our next meeting we can see what that language is and then decide at that point.
Looks like Vanessa might know something.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Vanessa Kahina on behalf of the Hearing Healthcare Providers of California. So the overview you've gotten is absolutely true and correct. The governor included a pot of money in the budget, but there's no actual language behind it yet. What they are intending to do is to draft and develop that language with the guidance of Department of Healthcare Services and have them be the administrative body for how the financial assistance would go out or for however vouchers would go out. We're not entirely sure yet, but we don't expect that language to be available until the May revision of the budget. So you have a little bit of time, but things are a little bit in flux right now in terms of how they develop language, so it's hard to tell.
I think that just because there may be a parallel development of funding for pediatric hearing aids doesn't change the fact that as a board we were initially in support of expanding access to pediatric hearing aids. So I don't see why we would want to change support of this initial bill. So I would still be in support of maintaining our support of this bill.
And you can always direct board staff to change the verbiage of our letter to be more reflective of just general access to care issue versus how we were before in the language, more specific in our support. It can be more general.
So say support in principle.
Something like that, yeah. So we support access to care, something along those lines.
Support access to expanding access to pediatric hearing aids.
Legal counsel, do we need a specific motion for that? Okay.
We're good.
Okay, the next bill on our list is AB 1075, California State University Speech Language Pathologist Programs. This was the bill that would require the CSU system, upon appropriation of general fund dollars, to allocate the funds through competitive grants to campus speech language pathologist programs. Of course, we were in support of this measure of expanding much needed access to SLP graduate programs. The 2019 Budget Act appropriated $3 million to the CSU system to increase enrollment. And so this specific bill was vetoed because the governor believes that the CSU Board of Trustees should have the flexibility to determine how to allocate those funds. The next bill under healing arts legislation is SB 425. This bill would require healthcare facilities to report any written allegation from a patient of sexual abuse or sexual misconduct by a hearing aid licensee to the board within 15 days. The board would be required to investigate the circumstances underlying the report of sexual abuse or sexual misconduct. This bill was signed by the governor and is now current law. SB 639 would prohibit a healing arts licensee from charging treatment or cost to an open-end credit or loan that is extended by a third party and that is arranged for or established in that licensee's office more than 30 days before the date on which the treatment is rendered or costs are incurred. This bill would also prohibit a licensee from arranging for or establishing an open-end credit or loan application that contains a deferred interest provision. This bill was also signed by the governor and is current law. Then under DCA-wide legislation for bills that would impact all boards, AB 476 would require the Department of Consumer Affairs to create a task force to study and write a report of its findings and recommendations regarding the licensing of foreign trade professionals with the goal of integrating foreign trained professionals into the state's workforce. This bill was vetoed by the governor because creating a new task force to try to integrate foreign trade professionals into the workforce is unnecessary. AB 613, the board has an approved support position on this bill, and it would authorize all DCA boards to increase licensing fees once every 4 years based on the consumer price index for the preceding 4 years. This bill is what's called a 2-year bill, which means it technically could still move forward this year, but at this time we don't know if it will or if it will be amended to something else. So right now it's just on here that I'll keep watching it and bring it forward if there's any movement on it this year. AB 1076 would require the Department of Justice to review its criminal justice database on a monthly basis and identify persons who are eligible to have certain arrests and convictions occurring on and after January 1, 2020 to be sealed. This bill would require the Department of Justice to grant relief to an eligible person without the eligible person to file a petition for such relief. This bill is a continuation of AB 2138, addressing criminal convictions. It was signed by the governor, but it will become effective next year. It had a specific date in it that said when it would be effective, but it will be becoming law. And then AB 1263 is a new bill for us to look at this year. It would prohibit a licensee from contracting for a consumer service that limits a consumer's right to file a complaint with the licensing board or participate in an investigation into the licensee by the licensing board. A violation of this provision would constitute unprofessional conduct and be subject to the discipline of the board. This bill came about from the Dental Board Sunset Review, in which it was brought up that direct-to-consumer orthodontic companies are requiring patients to sign an agreement to not file complaints with the board when they are issuing refunds to consumers who are unhappy with the service. What? Yeah. Our board has not really heard of any issues in our field about this type of thing happening. So I'm just anticipating that there won't be a workload increase that we'll see in the enforcement side because of this bill. And so I'm recommending a watch position. I'll keep monitoring it and bring it to each board meeting. Then AB 1616 would require boards that post information on their website about a revoked license due to a criminal conviction to update or remove information about the revoked license within 6 months of the board receiving an expungement order related to the conviction. The person seeking the change must pay a fee determined by the Department of Consumer Affairs that does not exceed the reasonable cost of administering this provision. This bill is another follow-up to AB 2138 regarding criminal convictions. It's designed to reduce barriers to licensure. Our board staff is currently looking at our business processes to see if there's a possible increase in our workload as a result of this bill. But at this time, we're recommending watch for this bill. And then SB 225 would allow a person 18 years of age or older and a resident of California to hold an appointed civil office, regardless of that person's citizenship and immigration status. That bill was signed by the governor and is current law. Then SB 601 would authorize a state agency to establish an application process to reduce or waive licensing fees for a person or business that has been displaced or is experiencing economic hardship as a result of a declared federal emergency. This bill was signed by the governor and is current law. And then another new bill for us to look at is SB 878. It would require boards to display the current processing times for initial and renewal applications on their website. During our peak licensing season, we were getting a lot of phone calls about processing time, so we actually started posting them on our website already, and we have been maintaining that. So I don't really see it as a huge issue for us. We will have to update it on a weekly basis if this bill passes. So there could be a slight increase in workload as we have to update it more often. But I'm recommending that we just watch this bill at this time. So is there any questions about any of those?
I just want to point out on licensing times that we actually do track that on a weekly basis. We track it internally, and licensing staff provides us with an update of a snapshot of where we are every week. So I don't think it would be a significant workload. I agree with you.
Could you go back to AB 1075? I'm just curious about something. You said that this bill was vetoed because why?
The governor believes that the Board of Trustees should have flexibility to determine the most appropriate administrative approach to providing the funds to the campuses.
Oh, okay, so this was already implemented.
The money was allocated, but the actual method within the bill was what was
yeah.
vetoed,
Yes.
right?
So the Board of Trustees took that on and did it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the governor didn't want to require the competitive grant process because there's cost to administering a grant program. So the governor thought it would be best for the Board of Trustees to just determine the best way to allocate.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you, Heather. We are now on item 10.
And Marcia.
Yes.
Okay. We're on item 10, and Marcia will be reporting on the Audiology Practice Committee update.
Okay, so when this issue was brought to the board by Dr. Maria Abramson, who's an expert on CAPD, thought that our
Excuse me, Marcia. I think what we're looking at first is the Audiology Practice Committee update from our meeting,
Oh, I'm sorry.
and then we'll go
I
to
thought you
11.
said go to the next tab.
Oh.
Oh. We'll hold that thought.
Sorry about that. We'll hold it.
Okay. Let me see where I put my notes. Okay. So the first discussion that we had was about changing the required number of clock hours for the RPE experience or the third year or fourth year internship. We agreed that we would agree to an 1,800 clock hour requirement. That we would also remove the language that addresses 3 different clinical experiences, the requirement. Both of those are regulatory changes. So we'll have to work on that. I think we agreed to begin work on those regulatory changes. And there's a statutory change. We agreed that insisting that this be accomplished in 12 months was prohibitive in that some people finish much earlier, and we don't want to make that there's liability insurance issues and so on. So I think we agreed to remove that language requiring, quote, no less than 12 months of satisfactory completed RPE. I'd rather have no time requirement, but only an hours requirement. It was recommended that the board staff revise the language, and we will, I think, bring it back for further discussion on that final language. And then eventually the board will seek a legislative author to make that change. So that's what might, any additions to that? Okay. So the second issue we talked about were the tasks that we feel that an audiology assistant or audiology aid, in our case in California, would be able to do. Long discussion about whether we want to have lists of can and can't do's in terms of tasks they can do. And we talked about an immediate step would be that the staff would develop perhaps a positive activity and or negative activity. We could approach those lists either way, not necessarily both, but we could, this is what you can do, and leave the rest to the interpretation. But use that information coupled with the various types of supervision levels from direct, immediate, and so on to see how those activities might meld with how much supervision they would have. We talked about asking California Academy of Audiology and other groups to weigh in on this proposed language before we move forward with it. I think we agreed to do that. But in the long run, we thought we'd eventually expand this to be part of the Sunset Review Report and bring it forward that way eventually. So we can seek public comment and so on with that. So again, that's where we left it as far as I know.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
Sorry, I couldn't be here yesterday when you were discussing. Was there any discussion on how the training process, what acceptable training processes would be, if that's going to change? In other words, right now, it's set up where the audiologist is having to write out the training program, what task would be appropriate, how they're going to train this individual, and how they're going to follow up on that over time. Is there any ability to, if that's going to remain the same, to also have an or provision there if they have completed a formal training program like the one through Nova Southeastern, or there's a couple other formal audiology assistant training programs available now, that are quite lengthy. But if that could be substituted for the audiologist having to write up their entire own plan, or was that discussed at all?
We only looked at actually the Cal State LA certificate program that does propose that well, actually its curriculum shows that they can do a lot. And I don't know about Nova Southeastern's program, but there is some concern about that because they're already out there giving that certificate. People are going off to do it. So we didn't talk about it in terms of that. We only reckoned with the fact that we need to do something and make this clear. How we approach a program like that, I'm not sure, let alone incorporating that rather than having to fill out the application. I don't know, Paul, we really didn't talk about it that way, that instead of filling out the supervisor's application with all their can they just show you their certificate from an accredited program for audiology assistants?
No, we
Does that
didn't.
fulfill that? We didn't talk about it, I
talk
know.
about that,
Any
no.
thought about that, or?
Because we're just addressing the audiology aid as it's identified right now in statute, not any future audiology assistant program. And I think that
Oh, yeah. That's not what I'm asking.
Okay.
Yeah. I just, because there are so many of these programs coming up that are available, usually online as well. So it's meant, it's a progression where, the person is doing these online courses and then the audiologist is supposed to be doing it with them in terms of what supervision they're offering and what they're training them on. And it's in line with how that program is set up. So just wondering if the discussion would be, well, if you've completed this training program within your office with your aide, if that would be something that would be acceptable rather than having to go through and write your whole plan down like you do right now from start to finish, and what that would entail.
I think that the registration of the aide is really a registration of the supervisor letting us know who is working as an aide. So right now that's not required. In law, the only thing that's required is what you've identified. So if they want to take the information from their training source or whatever and put it on that application, they can do that.
Is that how it works, that somebody would enroll in this distance learning course, they would be working for an audiologist in an office simultaneously? Is that right?
Correct.
I didn't know that model
Those
was
are the
out there.
programs that I've been using. I don't know about others, but that's what I've been doing. But, I just 10 years ago, last time that I was really registering an aide, I had to develop my own program and turn it into the board. I mean, I had to write every single task that person would be doing and every single way I was going to train them and then how I would observe them and how I would continue to monitor them. And it's very onerous to have to do all of that. And I think it's perhaps one reason why we don't have much use in this state, not a lot of audiologists using aids, because it seems so broad and like, how am I going to figure out this whole program? I'm going to have to do this for each individual. So
I think it would be hard for the board, if there's a lot of these online things, to go
Yeah.
investigate what they're learning in those.
Understood.
And then try to say, well, does it, because we don't even have some tight enough rules as it is.
Oh, agreed. I think you'll get more people using it if we have more definition of what an aide can or cannot do.
Mm-hmm.
I think one reason people don't use them now is because there's this fear and this gray area, like, well, I don't know, what can they do? And, what do I ask the board to allow them to do on my application? And I go through all this work and then the board says no, and then, just...
So, but to answer the question, we didn't discuss that because the discussion was more on the current aid designation and what we can do to provide consumer protection and make sure that the licensee population understands the parameters of what an aid is and what an aid can do. On a larger scale, though, I think we need to talk about the audiology aid itself and the need, and maybe that's an evolving designation that we could look at.
Okay.
Are we basically looking at defining their scope of practice, if you will, as we're looking at what they can and can't do? A lot of talking about maybe having a list of they can't do this, they can't do that. Are we in essence essentially defining their scope of practice?
I think scope of practice is a strong word for this designation, but I understand what you're saying.
In essence.
We are talking about parameters, yes.
Right,
Yes.
okay. Then from that standpoint, it would make sense to have a list of, if you're looking at how you define do's and don'ts, in my mind, the don'ts are the more critical because as you look from the side of enforcement, let's say, of, what are we going to, say you're not allowed to do that, then you have to have a fairly well-defined list. Otherwise, well, it doesn't say I can't. So therefore, I must, I can get away with it, if you will. And that could, from an enforcement standpoint, that could be a nightmare of how do you say that's not right or you're not allowed to do that.
Right.
It becomes a bit of a pill to have to create the entire list. But, again, I think if we look at diagnostic versus, administrative and task-oriented, it does help define it better.
So we can't continue to have this kind of conversation
Right.
on an update. And if it is something that the committee so desires to discuss at the next committee meeting, you can certainly put that on your agenda. I know you're going to be tackling a lot with your negative and positive lists to begin with.
Yeah.
But if you want to
But I do think it's valuable to hear the
Yeah.
input on what direction we want to go in. So I think that just to, going back to what you're saying, we have been there. And what I expressed yesterday during this conversation is that when I first came, I was on the tail end of this work that the board had done, and I think it was our legal opinion that we don't want to restrict this because it would create problems, because we couldn't identify everything that they can do. But looking at it from a practical standpoint, we have to identify those things that we know are out there that we want to put parameters around for consumer protection, because that's our mandate.
There's a way to say it that doesn't require a list.
Right.
You can just describe activities that fall into this and this categories are not to be supported in that way.
And if we have to come up with verbiage like that and a list, then so be it. That's what we have to do.
So we do need to continue working on it, and that's the
think that's
plan,
appropriate.
and then to expand it further.
I'm happy to work on that with you.
You're definitely not done seeing that.
Yep.
No.
Okay, that's my update, I think.
Just ask if there's any comments.
Are there any comments from members of the audience? Thank you. Okay. That not, we'll move on to
No, this one, yeah.
item number 11.
You sure?
I'll
Okay. So getting back to what I started talking about. Okay. So after we got this complaint that our current statement on CAPD on the web page was outdated and inaccurate, I did a lot of investigating, gathering opinions, reading articles, trying to get up to speed myself on the state of the science for CAPD. I developed a statement that revised our statement, and I sent it out to Dr. Abramson, who was the first person who brought this to our attention, and asked her if she would want to have other experts look at it. So she did have some of the leading national experts look at it. And really, they made a few small changes. I wouldn't say that hugely substantive change, because it already got at what her point was, and that is there is treatment, there is success. It isn't just this nebulous activity that nobody can lay their fingers on. But then I tried to make it a little more readable for consumers, because I think that professionals and consumers might look at this, and it is loaded with esoteric language. So we tried to make it a balance between those two things. So that's the statement that you have in your board binder. The idea of making it into one page was an idea, but Paul said that it didn't matter if it took 2 pages to say what we had to say. We would put in 2 pages. So that's why it is as lengthy as it is. So I think it meets the original complainant's comments. She is happy with it. Her colleagues seem happy with it. Whether consumers, what we didn't do, we did talk to Sydney Fox in Long Beach whether parents ought to look at this, and we didn't do that. So I don't know if you still want that to go out to parents that she may know and get their opinion. I'm not sure how helpful that would be, but other than readability. But I think it does now currently reflect the state of the science.
That's a good bottom line.
So it's going to replace attachment B,
Yeah,
correct?
I think we've had that old one in there. Mhm. We intentionally left off references because some of them are antiquated, and it was just difficult to reference things, so we're not putting them in the way they were last time. Although some of the information comes from some of those statements, it isn't, not a lot, shall we say. It's really so many sources, it would be an exhaustive list. I did provide Paul with that list, but it's 2 pages long itself. So we could do that if you want. No, do we have to accept this statement? Or?
I don't know that it's necessary, but we can put it on. We have this information. The board's looked at it. We can put it up on our website.
Okay.
Can you tell me again why we didn't have for more information you can go here?
Yeah, you can go here and here and here and here and here and here and here. And it's hard to do there.
One over the other.
Yeah.
There isn't a source, I would say, especially because the statements from the 2 national organizations are at least a decade old.
Oh, okay.
So it's really a living thing that's out there developing.
Okay. Okay.
It's not a bad idea to do, if there was such an entity.
Yeah.
But I think it's really difficult.
Okay.
We could look into it, though, a little more and see if there is anybody who would say this is the repository of all current information, because I don't think that exists, but I could
Because
ask.
I'm thinking, as a parent, if this was happening to my child and I come upon this website, there's usually for more information, go here, and then I would click on it, and then that website would lead me to other websites where I would just completely ignore this now and then just start going down a rabbit hole.
Let me at least ask about
Yeah.
it. That's my instinct about it, that there isn't such a place.
Yeah.
But I'll
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be like a repository of all information, but it could be just.
I'll tell you the other part of that is that the people who agreed to this statement as it is don't like the national statements.
Oh.
They don't want people going there because they think it's misinformation.
Okay. So
Because it's
so
very
this is a very fluid concept.
In a way, I mean, they would say it's not. It's an evolving
Oh yeah, it's an evolving concept.
aspect of the field of audiology, but there is progress. There is, substantial support for doing this
Okay.
work. So let me query that a little bit further, see if I can come up with anything.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just thinking, reading this, I'm like, oh my God, my child has this. Where is more information? If not, I would just Google CAPD, right? And then I would just go off.
And that could take you down any number of rabbit
It could take
holes.
me to, any number of rabbit holes. Yeah.
But I will check into it.
Yes, and the next item is item number 12, update and possible action on updating the board's website on telehealth information. We talked a little bit about issues related to telehealth yesterday, and we often get questions about seeking clarity on telehealth requirements in relation to licensing. Looking at our old or our current web information, it was probably written early on when we were referring to telehealth as telemedicine, and we wanted to update it. I know Brianne worked on it and Sharice worked on it a little bit. Sharice, can you tell us what we have in the attachments and what we should be looking at?
What you have right now on the first attachment is the current website, so I know it flips from the last one. So the first one is the current website, which has the telemedicine and telehealth language, and then attachment B has the proposed along with some red there. So in talking about telehealth, you can have non-clinical and clinical health services being provided via telehealth. So it's all still the same services, just provided via telehealth. So it was mentioned that we should potentially have some non-clinical services that might be provided over telehealth. And of course, being brand new, I was like, well, we should ask you guys what those might be, since not knowing your guys' fields that well yet. I wasn't sure if there were any sort of non-clinical services that are provided.
Not sure what that looks like. Changing a battery, is it that non-clinical?
I wasn't sure if that might pertain more to the hearing aid dispensers, talking about the hearing aid and programming, or if that's still considered a clinical service.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you define clinical, right?
That's where I was
I
at.
mean, that's the definition of clinical. What you would do primarily would be programming hearing aids remotely. Mm-hmm. Is that clinical? I mean, it depends on what you consider as clinical, right? Is clinical diagnostic testing, or is clinical dealing with, the whole, scope of what's going on with that particular individual and helping them beyond, just testing.
And I personally thought maybe it was beyond that part, maybe just the programming part.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately we have to decide what we're going to call clinical.
So is it better to leave out the clinical and non-clinical language?
Yeah.
Okay. So then we would go right into the next paragraph where we talk about telehealth is viewed as mode of delivery of healthcare services.
So because it's just a delivery of the services, there's not really a need to talk about the same scope of practice, same standards of care. So, I mean, it is, the standards of care go with it. So. Are there potentially any other points that maybe you hear often or have questions?
As I'm reading this, I don't know if in the first one, I thought I read something where it actually specifically said programming of hearing aids. It actually listed that specifically. I might be. There we go. Hearing aid dispensing. Okay. Because the only thing I can see from a dispensing standpoint would be someone in Idaho, and someone moves here to California, and then they remotely program their hearing aids for them, which, as you look at this, they don't hold a California license. But if programming of hearing aids is not specified, if it's a nebulous term, then is that something that's, we can actually get our hands on and get around, you know what I mean?
That might be the hard part, yeah.
Yeah. Because to me, it's from my standpoint, that's what this is really speaking to, is having a California valid dispensing license
to
program and work with that patient, because that could get, tough if you're not there with the patient, or the patient doesn't have the ability to get to you. If the consumer can't get to you, then, sometimes you don't know what adjustment you made to the hearing aid, may be detrimental, and there's no way for you sometimes to figure that out, via Skype. So.
And I think that's why we took that out in the revised version, because we don't want to encourage that.
I was just thinking about something. I know that the VA does a lot of speech-language pathology remotely, and I don't know whether they actually talk to veterans in Nevada and other western states I don't know that. But if they did, that would be unlawful, or is that a federal agency, so it's not under the jurisdiction?
A lot of times that is under the federal agency exemption. Depends on your specific practice act and programs, but I know in public health that was kind of the thing as well. VAs were under the federal exemption, so it would have to be something I'd look into further for you guys. So, because that could be one of the issues. And if programming of hearing aids is kind of more of it's within both of the audiology and hearing aid dispenser scopes, and we want to talk about that specifically, we could take a look at that. And whether that's doable now or not really.
They may not talk to anybody but Californians, for all I know.
Yeah.
But they could. I can imagine it. They're spread so thin that I can
Definitely
imagine
imagine
it happening.
Any other comments or questions?
So are we taking, we're going to be taking out examples of non-clinical telehealth services include, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then taking out.
But I think we said we wanted to just take out that part completely, right? The issue
Right.
dealing with clinical and non-clinical.
I think
Right,
the
so
whole
you
first
keep,
paragraph.
you keep the, yeah.
Right.
And then the second paragraph starts with telehealth is viewed as, I think the letter A is missing, a mode of delivery. And then in the second sentence and before applications, I think is the word of is missing, the use of applications.
Dr. Diaz just suggested that we remove the entire first paragraph, right?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was under the impression that the whole first paragraph could probably just
Right.
be removed.
Right.
But she's in the second paragraph.
I'm in the second
Yes,
paragraph.
right, the of and the A.
Yeah.
In reference to Mr. Borges' point, do we want to return the sentence? There's no legal prohibitions to using technology in the practice of speech language pathology, audiology, or hearing aid dispensing?
Is that from the first?
It's in the first attachment A. It's the second sentence.
Oh. Using technology.
I don't know if that was just clear. It sounded like maybe that was clearer to him.
That was my only question is it clear in how it's stated that, if we don't want them remotely programming a hearing aid unless they have a California license, do we need to be a little more clear about that specifically being in there?
Well, that's what the third and fourth paragraph talk about.
Right.
Is it because it's maybe more broad in the second paragraph? So practitioners providing healthcare services could potentially be providing speech language pathology, audiology, and hearing aid dispensing services? That make it a little clearer? So it's not so broad.
I think it's implicit if they're on our website, they're providing healthcare services, so I don't know if it needs to be.
Any other considerations?
Have we taken out the first paragraph, Paul?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, that's.
Okay.
For our staff too, for our enforcement staff, it's pretty straightforward. You're treating consumers in California, you have to have a license. The question that comes up oftentimes is, okay, I'm in Maryland, and can I provide these services in California? But now what about Maryland? And we always tell them you need to check with that state. So there seems to be confusion in that, but it's actually very straightforward.
People know to do that.
Right.
If it's anything like psychology where I came from, they just give us a call and we tell them the exact same
Right,
thing over the phone as you have to check with the state you're in.
Exactly.
We're okay as long as you're licensed here, but you need to check where you're at.
Okay.
Are there any other questions about or? Okay.
Yeah, we're going to take a 10-minute break right now. So. Moving on to the next item, number 13, and it is our executive officer's report. Paul.
I thought she was going to ask somebody to bring it.
Before I get to the report, I just wanted to, I know Marcia had a question about federal agencies when we were talking about telehealth, and Sabina and I were looking for the code, and Sabina found it for us. There is an exemption. It's found in BMP code 2530.5H. Persons employed as speech-language pathologists and audiologists by a federal agency shall be exempt from this chapter. So we knew it, but we wanted to just find the actual.
Those are typically referred to as an exempt setting.
I see.
So I know that Charisse is finding some travel documents for all of you, and I was going to go ahead and get started. I wanted to thank everyone for your participation in the board meeting, and a couple of our board members could not be here, but we did want to recognize our newest board member who is here. We're happy that he's joined us, and we have finally filled that hearing aid dispensing position that was vacated by Dean. I see Vanessa clapping back there. So.
I don't know, it's been 2 days. Are you still
So I just want to welcome Todd Borges. And at this time, Todd, if you have anything that you want to say.
No, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun. This is something that I'm very passionate about, so I'm really looking forward to working with everyone and getting to know everyone more and being a good, productive help. Thank you again very much.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you might regret it, but as I said, notice Brienne is retiring the day that I actually started. Just saying, but looking forward to it.
No indication.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, speaking of which, I want to start with just an admin personnel staffing update. Before I talk about the personnel part, I just want to inform you that the board office is embarking on a journey this year that's going to involve lots of work, lots of major projects. And we've been anticipating this for some time and trying to plan with our limited resources and our limitations as much as we can. A part of that was kind of knowing our own succession planning and where we were. And when I came to the board 5 years ago, I came to work with Brienne Humphreys, and I have enjoyed the time that I've been here. I'm not announcing my retirement. Let me put that out there. Yes.
Really got to start personally.
But one constant for me has been working with Brienne Humphreys. She came to the state a little over 10 years ago, right? Or about 10 years ago. She was with the medical board first, and then we stole her. She joined the board family. She always refers to our office as a family, and she helped me along the way in so many ways. As most of you know, Brianne is moving on. She's going to be retiring, and we're going to miss her. While Brianne has been here, while I have worked with her, she has been responsible for hiring our staff. As we've expanded, we've had to find places to put stuff. We're still in the small office that we're in right now. We've had to clear out closets, storage rooms. We even annexed a conference room in this building and turned it into storage/office. So everywhere you look, every room is occupied by either files, boxes, computers, or staff. We've got people everywhere. So Brianne's also helped the board through 2 sunsets. She's been involved with our most recent sunset, which went really well. When I came to the board, we were several months out in licensing to license an application, and that was one of her main projects when I came, is to streamline the process. And even though the numbers fluctuate, we have gotten it to licensing people within a week at times, but going from 12 to 16 weeks to where we are now, we've made some great strides. One of her main projects has been dealing with the hearing aid dispenser's practical exam, and she's been a big part of that. So, really appreciate Brianne. I'm gonna miss her. Like I said, she's been a constant for us, and we're gonna miss you, Brianne. We're gonna do something. Our staff is gonna do something for her still. But I just wanted to publicly acknowledge how much she has meant to the board office and how much we're gonna miss her. Thank you, Brianne.
I'd just like to say it's been a true pleasure and an honor working along each of you. I'm really going to miss you. Paul, I've enjoyed working with you, and I leave you in good hands with Cherie. She's already an asset to the board, and this is bittersweet, so thank you.
Thank you, Brianne. So I think it's been about a year that we've been planning and kind of trying to just decide on how we can make this transition happen. So we planned on we did something a little creative. We brought 2 managers in to work together. Well, not that creative for most of the world, I'm sure, but in government it can be complicated. We brought 2 people to work together, and we have a transition. So Brianne and Charisse have been here working together, and Brianne's going to be with us for a few more days. But we are happy to, I know most of you have met her, but to welcome our new Assistant Executive Officer, Charisse Burns, who's with us and has already gotten involved with our board meeting. Charisse has a background in public policy, state government administration, and actually comes to us from the Board of Psychology, where she managed a variety of things, including legislation, regulations, and policy. She's also worked with the California School Boards Association and the Department of Public Health. So we're pleased to have her with us, and we're trying to get this transition to be as smooth as it can. So thank you, Charisse. In addition to that, we have a workload. We're looking at each of our workloads and trying to prevent backlogs as much as possible. But we've known that our regulations rulemaking process workload has been backlogged, and we have a lot of work to do. So Charisse and Brianne and I have been working on hiring another regulations person to work as our coordinator, and we're going to continue trying to find the right person. It's not an easy skill set to find, as I've known for years and as I'm experiencing now. But I just want to let you know that we're still in the recruiting process, and our goal is to conduct interviews in the coming month. A few of the things that the board is going to be involved in, and that we're already involved in, is a business modernization project. The business modernization project is a huge project because that is basically taking our legacy database system and this other system that we work in, our application tracking system, and converting to a new system. And for many boards in the Department of Consumer Affairs, that's referred to as BREEZE. We haven't determined which system we're going to go into, but we're in the very beginning stages of that. And our staff have done a lot of mapping involved with business requirements, and we're still moving forward with that. We expect that that is going to impact our workload in many areas, because when we get to that point of planning and testing, they're going to have to pull staff away from licensing, they're going to pull staff away from enforcement, examinations. We're going to work our hardest to try to mitigate that as much as possible with temporary help funds, help from the department, but we do understand that that's going to happen. This is a couple years down the road. We're working on it now, but it's at least a 3-year process. We're also looking at sunset, which is not a 3-year process. That's actually upon us. We expect to get a questionnaire in the coming months and start the process of submitting our report. There's a lot involved with the questionnaire. There's data gathering, data analysis that we have to provide, but this also involves board member participation. We may call upon individual board members to help us come up with the drafting of reports or language, identifying issues, and typically we also present to the joint committee. This is a committee from the Senate and the Assembly, and we present our sunset report and answer any questions. So during that time, which we're looking at about a year from today, when we will actually be presenting to that committee, board members and myself will be presenting to that committee. So many of you were here. We did it last time. You know the great amount of work it involves. That's something that is coming this year. In addition to that, we have outgrown our space. So we're looking at a move. We're pretty far in the process of finding a location, but we were not able to secure it. We're competing with the private sector, which makes it somewhat of a challenge. So there's a lot of work that goes involved with planning, exhibits, the space, dealing with contractors. We got pretty far into the process, and we had to go back to square one. So we're pretty hopeful right now that we have a prospective location, and that's something that is going to be hopefully happening within the next 12 months. And I wanted to just make sure that everyone understands some of the things that we're experiencing this year. Any questions on that and our staffing before I go on to the next topic? Okay, and as I get more information about our new site, I will be happy to provide that to the board. The next item that we have in my report is your budget. And based on the most recent reports, you can see that we provided you with the operating expenditure report that we are projecting to have a surplus of about 3%. Typically, we try to get it to somewhere between 3 and 5%. We've reverted more in the past, but this year, with all of the expenses that we have an occupational analysis. We have our transition of the assistant executive officer and the temp help costs that go along with that. We're looking at about a reversion of about $75,000, and that's 3% of our budget. Any questions on our budget? Okay, I'll go to the next item. On page 2 of my report, you can see the licensing cycle times, and that's something that we have been doing just to kind of give everyone a picture of where we are. I do want to point out that this last peak season was a lot longer than it has been in the past. We also had some onboarding of new staff and some training that happened during that time. So the snapshots in time that we have here show you where we were. Specifically, we're looking at completed applications. And in that first line, that's how long it takes us to process a complete application. I want to point out that there were times, for instance, in between March and August, where those time frames got up to 8 weeks. But just kind of showing you where we are today, we're at 2 weeks. We review supporting documents for applications that are pending. It takes us about 3 weeks to get to those documents once they come into the office. And then RPE application verification forms are taking 3 weeks. Hearing aid dispenser applications are usually always current. Next section of my report shows you our most recent practical examinations that took place November 16th, 2019, January 25th. And you have statistics that accompany that information. Individual or passing and failing statistics. We also have included the upcoming practical exam and final filing dates, which are on our website. In enforcement, so far this fiscal year, we've received 137 complaints and subsequent arrest notifications. During this same time, we've issued 4 citations. I think that number might actually be higher, but only slightly higher. There are currently 18 formal discipline cases with the Attorney General's office, and we are currently monitoring 30 probationers. 7 of these 30 probationers require drug and alcohol testing, and 10 are in told status. The next page shows you all of the disciplinary actions that the board has taken for the last 12 months. There is one thing that I want to point out that I think it's important. I've mentioned it before, but I want to make sure that the board, that all of you understand this. Most of these actions you have seen because they come to you in closed session or during mail ballot vote. But California Code Regulations 1399.150.3 delegates to the executive officer to also approve certain actions. So names will appear on this table that you may not have seen. I want to just point out what those are. Those are voluntary surrenders, and those are default decisions. So when we file an accusation against a respondent and they don't respond, there's so much time that passes before it becomes a default decision. And there's processes within the Attorney General's office to ensure that we get the information to them. In most cases, there's the actual notice, there's courtesy letters that go out, and if the respondent still doesn't respond, it can become a default decision, and that's something that the board has delegated to me to approve. So we have some of those on this list, and when you see voluntary surrender of a license, that's typically something that I've approved also. Does anyone have any questions on that process? Then finally, I have the regulations that are actually already going through the process, the DCA initial review process, and we provided a status and comments on those 2 rulemaking files. In that same section, you can see that we have statistical information on licensing and enforcement behind the orange dividers. This time, if any board members have questions about my report, I'd be happy to answer them. One thing that always stands out in the licensing report, you can see how much our licensing population has increased in the last 5 years. We're now at approximately 33,000 licensees. And you can also see where the growth is. It's in speech-language pathology, as we mentioned yesterday. And if there are no questions, we can go to the next agenda item.
You want, the dates upcoming.
Yes, I think that's what we have to talk about. So future agenda items and future board meeting
here,
dates.
right.
I wanted to make sure that we put on the agenda the topic that we talked about previously, about audiologists doing cognitive testing of patients as part of their practice. I've been gathering lots of information, but I didn't prepare it for this meeting. But I'd like to and put that on the agenda.
Are there any other board items that board members would suggest that we agendize for the next meeting?
Do you want to talk about the locations, Paul?
Sure. Locations and dates?
I thought it was another future agenda item.
So Brianne, when is our next meeting typically held for February? We're talking about June, right?
Last time it was April.
But last time we adjusted the dates, right?
Right.
Okay, so
The date.
we're looking at
March,
May or
May.
June.
June, July, August, September, October, November.
So since we're in February now, we'd be looking at May or June, late May or June.
May.
This year, or as we get towards the end of the year, we're going to have probably some
Because
special
of the
meetings
sunset.
too, because of sunset. But
Yeah,
we may want to
because-
at least nail down the next couple of board meeting dates.
Having done it last year, I just want to recommend that we try to have the meeting for the fall, at least in October, so that allows us a teleconference in November for any final changes to your sunset report.
Okay.
That was kind of critical because of the DCA is going to require our final report to be sent to publications by December 1. So that's kind of just part of that built-in schedule. So it's helpful to get those kind of October as the latest for that in-person meeting so that we can have a quick teleconference if there's any changes, because you just never know.
So you're suggesting we look at, you said October?
Yeah.
So maybe June and October then?
And that way it spreads you across.
Mhm.
And that would give you enough time. You'll be looking at legislation, and it would allow us some time to at least get in front of the legislature in the second house before the end of session. So June and October seem best, depending on people's schedules. So
No, we'll get going now.
So what dates in June are we looking at? We're gonna make them now, right?
I was going to ask if you would like to do them now, we can, or if you'd like me to send out a doodle poll where everyone can just click on the link and tell me if you're available or not. And does that work a little easier? And then everyone can go home to their home calendar and take a look. Depending on how everyone's calendars work.
Well, I'm determining the site where we'll be.
Yeah.
Yes, because I believe normally you do
North,
a
south,
s-
north,
north,
south.
south, north. So normally your June would be in Southern California. So we would want to talk about whether you want to do LA, San Diego, Ontario, Orange County, any considerations you might want to have there, and then also the potential of using any sort of public educational institutions or other DCA offices that might have a hearing room available.
Mhm.
Don't know if there's any preferences or not.
When we stay in San Diego at that hotel, we usually stay in the hotel. Is that come
That's-
with the room cost, or we have to pay extra for that?
That's an option. We have to, we have to pay to use conference room.
Yeah.
But it's, I mean, we could look at that, or we could look at alternate locations. If you tell us where you want to have the meeting, then we can actually look at what the options are.
Exactly.
We said LA seems to
Okay,
be
yeah.
difficult.
Right,
Yeah.
and we've had
Oh,
problems
LA is
contracting
a
with
mess.
hotels in LA.
San Diego is always nice.
Yeah.
We did that nice from there.
San Diego has been convenient for us as far as getting from the airport
Yeah.
to location.
Right,
Just
right.
walk last time we were there.
Mm-hmm.
San Diego.
Really close.
So we're looking at San Diego for June, and
June.
then Sacramento would be
For
for
October.
October.
You also, I'm sure you received the email with the information from the director about other state facilities and buildings available for use down in Southern California.
Oh,
So
okay.
Paul
We
has that
haven't looked into
information
see if
also.
they have hearing type space available.
Yep.
All right. Well, barring that anyone has dates in June that are absolutely not available, or October that are absolutely not available, I'll give you like 3 or 4 options of Thursday, Fridays that work for staff, and then I'll send out a doodle poll. That way you guys can just kind of click on there, tell me what's available, and the most attendees wins.
Okay.
Kind of the thing.
The other thing I wanted to mention is when it comes to teleconference meetings, we know that things could happen that that may prevent someone from being able to be at their location. We haven't had much of an issue in the past, but what we want to do is maybe prevent that from happening in the future by using more regional locations. And as Sabina mentioned, we received our new director, Kim Kirkmeyer, sent us locations that we could use, other state offices, other DCA offices. So the idea is to have board members in a certain region gather at one place. That way, if for some reason a board member was not able to make it, we could still continue to have the meeting and someone would be there at the meeting to allow public access. So be looking for that, especially as we get closer to sunset. Or any, legislative issues may come up where we may need a board decision. It can happen in enforcement, closed session, so just be prepared for that. I think we're going to try to implement this structure in the coming year. Any other questions? So are we set for now?
I think that's the easier way to do it. That
Okay.
way we're not hashing out dates.
Okay. Well, new board members and maybe the rest of the board have access to our previous sunset report, that they get an idea of what it's like.
Yes, and I'd be happy to provide anyone with a hard copy. We also have it on our website if you need it. It's it's a couple hundred pages, so I have
But
some hard
that's why
copies.
I think if they have a chance to see what it is.
Yes,
It
absolutely.
helps.
But I just I'm saying that in case you don't want to print it, I have copies that you could have so you don't waste all your home paper. Nice, glossy, beautiful copies for you.
Then you're up.
Actually, I think.
Okay, one more thing.
So on behalf of the board, oh, thank you.
You don't have to open it, except for one thing.
Yeah.
You have to open this, which isn't wrapped,
Which one?
this one, and you have to show us.
Okay.
Sorry, it isn't wrapped. I'll tell you that long story. You have to read it out loud.
A wise woman once said, "I'm out of here," and she lived happily forever. Thank y'all so much.
That's gorgeous. That's beautiful.
This is a medium.
Where'd you
Looks like
find
you
that?
could sleep in it. Etsy.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much.
This is from everybody, and see the card there, so we'll miss you.
Okay, thank you, I'll miss y'all. Okay, thank you. What a surprise.
Okay.
Do you have anything else? Otherwise, we're ready to. Do you have anything?
Okay, yeah, I think we are ready to adjourn. Yeah. We are ready to adjourn.
Thank you all.
Are you going to sign this?